So here's where I think we are. I think about this a lot, and this is where I think we are in the field of assistive technology. Whether you're one of the new teams that's just starting out this year, or whether you're a member of a team that is sophisticated and experienced. What we know is that we've been doing this assistive technology work for 20 years, and in fact I started doing it in 1988, so we're almost up to 30 years at the OTAP program. That's when OTAP started. So we like to say that OTAP is in the 28th year of a 2-year grant, because it's work that we got to do together early on, and we have continued to do it. Where I think we are is that after 20 years, or 30 years, or however many years you've been doing it, we're pretty good at providing services that help us match the student needs to the technology needs. We use the SET framework and customized trial periods, and we've been able to show that a tool can be effective for a student with disabilities, and that's for the whole range of students with disabilities. In the last week, I've had the opportunity to work with a high school student who has significant learning disabilities and uses AIM for almost all of her schoolwork. I also had the opportunity to work with some pretty severely disabled elementary school students who have multiple disabilities and are learning to use augmentative communication. So what these are the big ideas that I want to talk about today. The first one is making sure that everyone has a role to play. We're going lack of knowledge about AT supports. Oh, that's interesting. That makes me think hard already. A disconnect between the AT team and the IEP team. Okay. Time to put in with training all those involved with the implementation. So training is another big barrier. And we're going to talk later in this series more about training. Teachers have limited time to learn new tricks. Attitudes. Okay, Deb, you have to tell us more about attitudes. You can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to. We don't have to do all this in the chat box.
All righty. Well, when I say attitudes, it may encompass some of the lack of time and lack of knowledge because many people, if they don't have that time, then they kind of put up a wall that I'm not going there because, well, it could be partly because they don't see it as their role. There's a lot of reasons, but people shying away from it partly because of a fear that they don't know what they don't know.
Something else. Okay, so attitudes which may come from some of the other things that people mentioned. Thank you for that. So these are some of the big ideas we're going to talk about today. The big picture idea is that so far we have not been able to demonstrate as effectively as AT assessment strategies implementation. So we wonder, I hear people say all the time, oh my gosh, we picked out the right assistive technology. We went and got it. We made sure it was working in the classroom and on the network and with the printer and all that stuff. And we went away and we came back a little bit later, 2 weeks later maybe, and it wasn't being used. So that's a thing that we hear more often than we want to. And what we're learning is that it takes more than just a good assessment to make technology an everyday tool in the classroom. What I believe is that we are headed more and more to a more effective approach with universal design and the idea that all of our technology has some accessibility features in it these days that could be applied to kids in the classroom. So one of the things we're doing over time is changing the way we look at assessment and starting first with technology that might be in the classroom and then going to more specialized technology if that doesn't work at first.
Gail, are you saying that if we implement UDL that we don't have to worry about assistive technology anymore?
Oh my gosh, no. Thank you for asking that question because I really don't believe that. We talk about the definition of assistive technology being an item or piece of equipment that helps a child overcome barriers. So for some of the kids in our classroom, they can use the same kind of universally designed technology that that is available in the classroom automatically, and teachers can encourage them to do that. But some of our students will need that technology and actually require it for their educational programs. So if you gave everybody in a classroom, for instance, an iPad that had text-to-speech, and you taught every child in that classroom to use it, some kids would choose to use text-to-speech automatically. Some kids would say they don't like it because it slows them down, and they would just read because they're good readers. Some kids would maybe be told that they have to use text-to-speech. And the difference is, if you take those iPads away from most of the kids in the class, they'll be able to do that reading task in a different way. But for kids with assistive technology, they will need that technology in order to do the reading task. So that's the definition of assistive technology that I like to work with. It's not a legal federal definition, but some kids will still have to have assistive technology on their IEPs because they need that technology in order to make progress in their curriculum. So the question for today is, how can we create an infrastructure to encourage and support AT implementations in classrooms? By infrastructure, I mean, how can you build into your assistive technology systems and the things you do in schools ways that automatically include people in the assistive technology planning process and also in the AT implementation process. So let me say, these are ideas that I have used and tried out and that work for me, but we're not in the realm of answers right now. We're in the realm of ideas and thinking clearly and deeply about the kinds of things you do, the kinds of things I do, and whether or not they facilitate good implementation practice. So this is a quote from Roseburg newscaster, who was talking about something entirely different when he said this, but I wrote it down immediately because I think for most of the training that I do these days, my goal is not to get you to think the way I think, but to help you think more than you thought before. So hopefully there'll be some new ideas here today that will give you thoughts and ideas about how you might change your systems and the things you imply when you're talking to people about the services you provide in order to present and encourage people to take ownership of the assistive technology program. So everybody who comes in contact with a kid might have some kind of ownership. I firmly believe that in assistive technology, and especially in implementation, everyone has a role to play. The other thing I believe refers back to some of your chat box comments that where Deb mentioned attitudes, but other people said some marvelous things about what keeps people from implementing. And a big picture one that I really liked was the disconnect between the AT team and the IEP team. You see that disconnect most hugely in clinical assessments that then have recommendations for school practice. So if you've ever had a child, worked with a child who went to OHSU or a speech and hearing clinic, a local speech and hearing clinic, or some assessor who provides that service for a fee or something, sometimes there's an even bigger disconnect because the distance between you and the assessor is bigger than most AT educational programs. I firmly believe that the farther apart the assessors and the people who make recommendations are from the people who have to implement, the less likely AT implementation will be successful. So if you and I are working like this together with the AT team and the IEP team working together, crossing boundaries and coming up with ideas together, we're much more likely to have implementation than when I'm in a different building and don't understand what's going on in your classroom. So that's, I think, a basic principle for me of AT implementation, is making that distance as small as possible as you think about your AT services.
I see a comment here that Jill made too, when she said that technology that they're using will malfunction, either operator error or tech malfunction, and that's a biggie too, because some of us, when we're on the front line, sometimes you get to learn how to fix things by being in the fire, but sometimes when you're working with a student, you have a limited amount of time to start with, and then you're spending your time spinning your wheels trying to get something to work, and it's not working. And oftentimes when you're working with a student who might have a difficulty with change and not a good level of managing frustration, it's hard to get back to it. It can be a shutdown on both parts, the student and the person trying to make it work. So that's a biggie.
So that's a good example of the idea that's up on this slide right now, which is, I want to suggest that if you are thinking in that way, if you're thinking, okay, what about technical assistance and malfunctions of devices and things like that? One of the things that I want to challenge everyone on this call to think about as you do that is, how could you make it more possible for the teacher who gets into that situation to solve the problem without having to call you as a specialist? So are there, and that'll be different in different districts. One of the reasons we don't have good answers for AT, any kind of AT service like this is the right way to do it, is because of the geography and the populations you serve and the number of people in your population. All those things affect how you will do things. But in the case where there's a technology breakdown, I'm a resource room teacher. We're trying to work on text-to-speech with a 5th grader who has autism, and the technology fails or gets mixed up somehow. What could those people do in addition to contacting the AT specialist that would make them more independent and take more ownership of their own, of the child's assistive technology program? So it's a question I ask myself every time I run into a situation these days, because I think one of the things that has happened to us as a field of assistive technology providers is that we have come to think of ourselves as helpers to such a degree that sometimes we help too much. And that's true for kids, but it's also can be true for the teachers that we provide supports to. Sometimes you want to be right there and helping, and we'll talk about that later on in the webinar. It's how do you make that decision? How do you differentiate the supports you provide so that you can be as efficient as possible in providing your services? And Deb, I really appreciate your pointing out things in the chat box to me. I'm realizing when I share my screen, I don't see the chat easily, so keep doing that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Okay. So, another thing that's been mentioned recently is this thing about change. And I always have to say when we talk about implementation that it's really important to recognize that asking a classroom teacher or an instructional assistant or a speech and language clinician or anybody to adopt new ways of doing things that include assistive technology is a kind of change. I always like to give the example of, if I said to you, when you go back to your school tomorrow or when you come into your office tomorrow, you have to move your desk. And if we take a minute and think about, okay, first of all, Gail doesn't have the right to say that to anybody, but if she did, what are the kinds of things that go through your head? So the kinds of things that go through your head are, oh my gosh, where would I move it? How would I move it? Where am I going to plug things in? Who's going to help me move it? It's heavy. Things like that. So you begin to make meaning out of this change that somebody is requiring of you. And always, when we have new experiences, we end up having to do that thinking. What will I do? How will I do it? Even when we agree that we should do it, there's a whole lot of questions that come up that need to be answered. So change is personal, and each individual person has to make meaning out of it for themselves. Now, this is a quote from a book on loss and grief, but I think it's really true in our educational programs. And so it's important to acknowledge that when we begin to ask teachers to do differently or more implementation.
But Gail, it's the way it's always been done.
Yes, and so we're asking for change, and we have to acknowledge that people have to make meaning about that change. They have to figure out what it will mean for them. Sometimes it also means that we need administrative support to say, yep, this is a change we're going to make. We have change is personal, so we have to connect our peers with purpose. Michael Fullan, if you're interested in educational change, I really recommend that you read some of Michael Fullan's books on educational change. He is the head of the Toronto Institute for Educational Change. It's a big institute that has done worldwide studies and projects on educational change and how to change systems. The two I'm most familiar with are, he took on the entire British education system because Great Britain is one school district, and also he's done a whole lot of work in China trying to modify their systems. So he's a good read, and all of his books are around 100 pages and easy to read, so I do recommend his work if you want to think more about educational change. Now, we don't have time today to delve into that idea in great detail because we really want to apply some of the concepts that we're talking about to technology and to technology integration. So I will leave you with that citation and recommend it's a book you might want to read. Here are some other good reasons to think about supports that focus on shared responsibility. First of all, interventions that are have shared responsibility can be applied throughout the day. I was talking with a speech therapist earlier this week who said, well, they do the augmentative communication program when I'm in the room, but I don't think they do it any other time. So she goes into a classroom to try and help integrate an augmentative communication device in that classroom setting, but she's not confident that other people are doing it without her presence. That's a real inefficient use of her time and the time in the classroom. We know that interventions that are applied more often and throughout a day are much more likely to make a difference for kids. So it's important that we do that shared work, and it also helps educators expand their skills so that they can apply them to the next kid that comes in without maybe even calling you at all. And frankly, if you have worked yourself out of a job in that classroom because the educator is now really good at using the universally designed features in a particular device or something, there will be others who need your help. I don't think we're talking about job security here. I think we're talking about expanding the body of knowledge and building the capacity of your whole agency to provide high-quality assistive technology services to kids. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. If you're not aware of the paradigm of TPAC, it is really a paradigm that comes very much from general education technology, and it talks about the ideas behind what goes into a good technology program in a school. So TPAC stands for Technology, Pedagogy, and Content Knowledge. And let me just walk you through what it means, because I think we're seeing a trend that this model describes really nicely, particularly with our mobile technologies, our tablets, our phones, smartphones, and all the different kinds of technologies that are showing up in schools that have universal access features. So originally in education, and we're talking, in this slide, we're talking about in the 1930s, I think, we began to know early on that teachers needed two kinds of knowledge. They needed content knowledge. They needed to know about the history or the construction skills or the science curriculum, the chemistry curriculum, something like that. But they also needed some specific knowledge about how to teach, the pedagogical knowledge about how to teach made an enormous difference in whether or not teachers were effective or not. So the field of education, as early as the 1930s, started recognizing that we had to have both things, and that's actually when we began to get teacher education programs. Earlier than that, it was felt that if somebody knew how to read, they'd be able to teach reading. And what we've discovered over time is that that's not necessarily true. The times that I remember most when I saw how untrue that was when we saw my local high school here in Roseburg had for a while a construction skills program, and they hired contractors to teach the program. So those guys knew how to build houses like crazy, and they actually built houses in the parking lot, little tiny sheds and things with the kids. But what happened was if you walked into one of those classes, the teaching that was going on was really spotty, often pretty chaotic, and not everybody was getting instruction because those construction, it was guys in those days, didn't have the teaching skills. So now we know that we have to, even when we do things like career technical education, we have to give those people some educational background on how to manage classrooms and things like that. But still, in many places in this country, not as much as it used to be, but many places in this country, we treat the technology as a separate subject. So you can go to classes on how to use Excel, but when you take those classes, it's rarely true that they will teach you not only how to use Excel, but how to teach other people to use Excel and how to include it into your classroom instruction. So the TPAC model actually looks like this. The TPAC model suggests that you need technology knowledge, you need teaching knowledge, and you need content knowledge, and that you need to know how they overlap. So if you're going to teach chemistry, you have to know the technology that could be applied to teaching chemistry. If you're going to teach chemistry, you also have to know how chemistry is best taught. And we know a lot about that. We know it ought to be hands-on. There ought to be lab things and physical experiences that kids get to have. It's when all three of these topics meet together in the middle that we get the TPEC knowledge, the content, the pedagogy, and the technology. But here's where I think we are with assistive technology. Even though we're seeing more and more schools do a really good job of teaching technology content and pedagogy as a unit, we often treat assistive technology as if it were something separate. And so we will do augmentative communication classes on how to use the device, but perhaps not relate them to the pedagogy of teaching. How are you going to teach a child, you teacher, you self-contained elementary school teacher, how will you teach children to use their augmentative communication? And what content needs to be addressed with those kids in order for them to be effective AC users? And here's the other thing I think has happened. So first of all, the suggestion is that there's an overlap. Rather than teaching assistive technology in isolation, we ought to be looking at the overlap. So the first overlap, let's do the history of that real quick. Around 1990, which is about when I started in assistive technology, there was separate assistive technology, and there was pretty minimal, even in those days, instructional technology in schools. We had special devices that taught you how to, identify your colors or do your math problems, but they were not related to assistive technology. And most of the assistive technology that long ago was for kids with obvious and significant disabilities, students who were blind, physically handicapped, hearing impaired, the low incidence disabilities. In 2004, we started to see an overlap. We had some technology that could be used both as instructional technology and as assistive technology. So that's when we began to see, like, Macintoshes could talk, things like that. In 2010, we began to see a huge overlap. And what happened in 2010? Who knows? So 2010 was the introduction of the iPad. And as we have seen more and more tablet technology show up, we see more and more of an overlap. So here's what I think today looks like. We have some specialized assistive technology. We're sort of back to kids with low incidence disabilities. Augmentative communication needs, vision, hearing, things like that are very specialized and need to be addressed separately from the general technology. We have some technology that's only instructional technology. Some of the canned reading programs, some of the canned math programs, and just walk you through drill and practice kinds of things are pretty much only instructional technology. But for the most part, many of the tools that we have today can be used both as assistive technology or instructional technology, and it is up to us to make the distinction. So we talked about change and how change is affecting us as AT teams. And I think this is a significant challenge to AT teams today. This overlap should have caused us to change our practice a little bit and change how we do things so that we're not only treating assistive technology as if it were this separate. But as things came closer and closer together in terms of what's assistive technology and what's instructional technology, our systems for doing assistive technology services may not have changed enough. So we have to make meaning out of our changes too. The question is, how can we adjust our service model to respond to this overlap? What can we do? I do think that universally designed technology supports universally designed technology requires more integrated supports. So what we know from research is that when teachers are taught to embed instruction in everyday routines, children make more progress. When instruction is not separate, even if it's augmentative communication instruction, things like that, children make more progress if it's part of an everyday routine. But when our focus is one-to-one, one child at a time, sometimes that makes integration more difficult. So hopefully you can see right now that what we're really doing for today is being pretty philosophical. In our next webinar, we're going to go much more into some very specific practical things. Our next one is on data collection, and we'll be talking about some real practical things that you can do to keep and report data. But for today, about half our time now has been spent in sort of this philosophical presentation about how we might design our services so that they are more integrated with what teachers do in classrooms every day to address that disconnect that somebody talked about earlier between IEP team and the AT team. So let's talk about some specifics here. When we talk about AT support skills, that's the kind of thing that your AT teams are doing over time. If I asked each of you to say what your AT team did, you would be talking about the supports that you provide to teachers in different ways. They're all doing it differently, but you'd be talking about them in different ways. Now, these are skills that you just have to have in order to be able to do that. You just have to be a good communicator, a good listener, a reinforcing person, and have some good information sharing skills. One of the things that we did a few years ago, it was an Oregon project, was that we began to talk about what would it look like if we provided high quality supports to staff in schools. So this is a project that actually came from some work that we did with OTs and PTs in Oregon schools, but I wanted to share it with you because we modified it so that it just applied to providing supports in general. In this project, we developed quality indicators, just like the quiet indicators, but quality indicators for providing high-quality support services. We talked about evaluating our own consultations, doing self-assessments with these quality indicators. And you have this as a handout. It was sent to you today. We're going to actually use the first page of it in just a minute as an activity in the middle of this Yale Talking a Lot webinar. But people have used these indicators to do self-assessment, to rate an individual consultation process, to ask the person that you're working with to rate how it went for them. But it also has been used a lot as a guide for and focus for program improvement. So that's the way we're thinking about it today, I think. In that project, we discovered that there were really 6 stages of providing assistive technology support or any kind of support. Doesn't matter what model you use. It doesn't matter your approach to providing supports. These were the steps that people needed to take in order to provide good supports that were coordinated and most effective. So you can see here there's an initiation of the support relationship, an initial definition of the area of concern, established expectations about the support relationship. These 3 we found were the ones that people least often did, and I found that really interesting. Once we got into information collection, outcome identification, intervention, evaluation of effectiveness, steps 4, 5, and 6, we saw people having a fairly consistent process for doing those things. They could clearly identify where they were. But one of the things we discovered was that the step 1 was the one that most people skipped, whether they were OTs and PTs working in OT and PT practice or whether they were assistive technology specialists working in as assistive tech, providing assistive technology.
And something else, Gail, I'd like to add is whenever you talked about the importance of listening, I mean, it's always important no matter who our audience is or what we're trying to accomplish. But in listening and trying to initiate that relationship, I think it's important to hear or to be aware of maybe underlying issues that are starting to come out, but also to meet that person where they are. So many times we start talking about technology and we're off on acronyms and everything, but the person who may be just at the baby steps needs to know that they're comfortable and competent in each level before they move on. And so it's you know, meeting people where they are is just a distinction I wanted to make.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good, you know, we could have retitled this whole webinar, meeting people where they are. It's a great way to say that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later in our section on coaching skills. But what I wanted to do here was to talk about these stages, because somehow in that first stage of providing support, the first time you meet somebody or the first time you go into a classroom this year, even if you've known the person for a long time, it's really important to take some time to agree on a process for interaction and acknowledge the expertise that each person has. So if we say, okay, this year, Al has a new goal. He's going to take messages to the office and get an answer and bring it back to the classroom, and he's going to do that using his augmentative communication device. So that's a pretty big goal for Al. What we want to talk about is, here's what you will have, what I have to contribute to that is some knowledge about the outcome device, but as a teacher or as an instructional assistant, you have a whole lot of knowledge that needs to be brought to the planning of that. So that acknowledgement of knowledge. So the quality indicators that we developed for this step is that we're going to reach consensus about how we work together. How often are we going to talk? Fairly well, but I'm going to show you a video here that was developed to go with these quality indicators where that definition was not done
School district. How'd the first week go?
Well, I'd say it was a little rough. I mean, I've been a PT for over 20 years, and I think I have a pretty good idea what to do with children, but it just doesn't seem to be enough.
Even though I had worked as an OT in other settings, I remember it took me quite a long time to figure out how to be effective working in the schools. One of the key skills was learning how to consult with school staff.
I thought I knew how to consult. I was pretty successful doing it in the hospital. You told the patients what to do, and then if there were problems, you told the doctors and the nurses. It was so much simpler. The schools just seem, well, it's so different, and it seems more complicated.
I think I can give you some pointers, but first tell me, how did Monday go?
Well, the day didn't start very well because I had trouble finding the school. Well, you know how it goes. The later you are, the later you get. The PT that I took over for told me Cassidy had some problems with her walker. And she had some problems using a classroom chair. So I figured I'd just take care of both those problems while I was in her classroom.
Excuse me, who are you and what are you doing?
Oh, I'm Dana. I'm the PT. Don't worry about me. I'm just going to fix Cassidy's walker.
All right. All right, class, let's get back to our, I'd like to be the first to, I'm sorry, but what are you doing with Cassidy?
Well, I'm using her this pattern to get her upper and lower abdominal to cooperate together.
And how about improving her handwriting?
Her handwriting? I don't do that. That's OT's job.
Okay, so here's clearly a person who did not do that step one. She did not introduce herself. She did not identify the area of concern. What, you know, the first time I showed this to a group of AT people, I said, I hope this is okay because it doesn't really address specifically assistive technology. And somebody said to me, oh no. She said, I often have to deliver equipment in my job, and I'm rushing between one school and another to deliver equipment. So I run into the back of the room, I set up a computer, and I can see myself being that PT. I can't imagine what the teacher must feel like when I run in and start setting up equipment while she's trying to teach reading or something. So it was interesting in doing this study that we discovered that it was the first two steps that people most often skipped. They jumped right into collecting information and beginning to try things with treatment without involving the classroom staff in a way that made them feel like it was part of their job, that it was a joint effort, and that the expectations for what was going to happen were established. What I want to suggest to you is that we did provide you with the self-assessment tool that goes through these 6 stages and the quality indicators of assistive technology. But for now, what I'd like to suggest is that we have a brief conversation about how you describe what you do in your role as a supporter. And also, how do you describe the limits of your support? So when you're meeting somebody for the first time, or when you're talking about how things are going to go in the classroom, how do you say what you will do? And also, how do you say, you know, it's beyond the scope of my practice to turn the digital files into a format that could be used by your student who's using AIM, or it's beyond the scope of my practice to program the augmentative communication device every day, or it's beyond the scope of my practice to collect data. So I'm wondering if you as teams have thought about how you describe that. And I'm going to warn you here, I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute and ask you to either raise your hand or type in the chat box. How do you talk to people when you're first meeting them about your assistive technology services and what you do?
Well, I would have to say, Gail, that I'm hoping that when we do our SET meeting, that the people who have who work with the student and support the student in any way, I'm hoping that they're in the SET meeting to start with, where we're all introduced and we're all looking at the student information and we're making decisions. Because then that person has the opportunity to ask questions and to chime in with what actually happens in the classroom. So it's whenever you are planning your set, that's why I think it's so important to have everybody in the room so that everybody's expertise can be heard. And so I like to have that introduction before all of the decisions are made, so we get that important buy-in you're talking about.
Absolutely, and if I have my choice, I'm going to start involving everybody from the very beginning, long before we get to implementation. But I do think the implementation process requires another look at how we collaborate and how we are going to work together to make this thing work, and that's the kind of thing that I want to suggest that we think about. If we aren't going to be able to talk about it right now, because we are running out of time. So, Deb, you should know I just muted you because I muted everybody at the same time, so you might want to unmute yourself because we're having a good conversation here. I do see a new Angie says, I'm a little unclear about your question. Are you asking about how we introduce ourselves to the student? No, Angie, I'm asking about how do you talk from the beginning? How do you avoid that thing that you saw in the video, and how do you talk from the beginning to people about the kinds of supports that you're going to be providing so that they know what to expect and what their role is? I don't know if you have ideas about that, or...
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
yeah.
you are.
Thanks, Andy.
I think it just really all depends on the situation. If a student goes through our traditional referral process, then we've already had somebody out to do a screening to talk about what the tools the classroom has already, and so then by the time we get to implementation, we've already, established that relationship at the beginning stage. But then other times we'll just have a teacher with a question, and we'll run out or answer the question via email, or then make an appointment. A lot of times we make appointments so the teacher knows that we're coming and why we're coming and what we're doing, and so they don't look at us like we're crazy. But I guess we just get information and requests for things in so many different ways. It just kind of depends on the situation. But I don't think as a practice we usually make a cold call to deliver something.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Well, yes, I agree with you. What I'm suggesting is that sometimes we make assumptions at the point of implementation, that because we've done all the conversations ahead of time and we've done the set process and we've had a lot of contact with the person, that we know what's going to work best for them in terms of implementation. Talking about.
Well, and there was a comment from Diane in Sutherland, and this is, they are going through the AP Teams training right now, and she just wanted to voice that she knows that their whole team in trying to develop their processes is trying to find ways or a time and it goes back to that four-letter word, time, to work with teachers as a team because everybody is so busy. So the scheduling and the meetings and making things work after school. So they are starting off with a concern about having the conversations that bring you together.
Right. So let's talk about one strategy that might help with that. One of the things I do think is that if we can develop responsive systems, we may be able to help with some of those time issues. One of the things I think is that as you're developing a new system, especially for Sutherland and teams like that that are just beginning to participate in HE Teams projects, what you may want to think about is how can you do what I would call a form of triage. Triage is the thing that medical people do when they decide, okay, here's 5 patients that have just come in from a car accident, and this is the one that needs a lot of attention, and these 3 can wait and be okay for a while without that. So we all have some way of thinking about that. An idea I want to propose to you is that in your referral system, you think about a couple of things that might help you decide how to use your time wisely. So the first part of this is that you may want to try an online referral form or survey that asks the people to describe the child and the type of support they need. So it could be a Google form that you fill out. It could be a SurveyMonkey thing, but something online. Part of the reason for having an online referral like this is that it will help you later in your data collection. And also, it means that the first step to somebody requesting support for a child that maybe, you got set up with assistive technology a year ago and didn't see things worked well, and now things maybe need to be updated or changed, but that requesting support comes from the classroom. And we really want to make that connection between the classroom and the AT team. So Hyatt is the highest students assistive technology program out of Montgomery County, Maryland, and I do a lot of work with Denise DeCoste, who helped start that program. Their requests for support survey questions are also a handout that you got today to think about how you might do things in your initial referral. And I want to try in my own practice to get away from calling it a referral form, because it implies a whole lot of demographic information, disability-specific information, things like that. At the point of implementation, not that assessment, but at the point of implementation, I think it's appropriate to say to the team, what kind of help do you need? So if you look at this list of questions, the first question is, what prompted you to make this request? And depending on the answer to that, whether that was the teacher's idea or a parent idea or somebody suggested it, things like that, you may respond differently to a request for support. You're, of course, going to need information about the student, but this is how this form looks. So it's an online survey. Again, they use SurveyMonkey, but it could be any kind of survey tool. They ask a bunch of questions like this, but what I did was I copied the questions out of the survey and put it on a slide because it would be easier to read. So how would you rate your team's ability to do these things? Identify and prioritize critical barriers to learning for this student or for a specific student. How would you rate your team's ability to collaboratively problem solve? So the questions here are, how's your team doing on this slide? And depending on the answers, and the answers are not comfortable, somewhat comfortable, very comfortable. So depending on the answers, you might treat your referral differently. Again, these questions are about ongoing implementation. How would you rate your team's ability to use a team process to integrate technology tools into routines? If you already, what is the knowledge of the following tools? And then there's a list of tools. The difference between this and a standard referral form is that the focus is what do you want help with? You might not use these questions. I've known several agencies now that have developed other questions, but the request for support rather than an individual student referral, I think is a really important paradigm shift that you might want to consider as you begin to look at involving everyone on the team. And then,
well, and we also, whenever people are filling these out, sometimes, and we implemented this at Special School District and trying to get more information from them up front. But one of the things that we found is sometimes people are just answering questions to get through the survey. So I don't know, and you know, you'd see the same person do a survey the next day, and they were different levels of comfort than they were the day before. So making sure that it's not too many questions, because then people just start filling things in, but you know, precise questions that that don't make it an ordeal for people to consider. And I'm not suggesting that it should be an ordeal, but that's one of the things that we found. If you put too many questions, people are not always going to answer them. They're just going to mark them.
right. So this list that you got today as a handout only has 6 questions on it.
Yeah, that's good.
Because of that, it is not a referral form. It is an identification of what kind of help the classroom needs. Now, one of the things that I know is a transition and a change for people is that if you're doing that, that assumes that people will be asking you for help. So there's a period of time when you institute a change like this, if you're not starting from scratch, where you may have dual systems going, and it could be a little confusing.
I think that was the issue here, because it was much easier before. Now I've got to answer questions. So it was during that transition to new practices that we got the most rub, but I think it's probably going very well now.
Okay, and then once that survey is filled out, it gives you some documentation and some information about what kinds of things you ought to be doing. Some teachers will say, oh, we need training. Some people will say, oh, we just need the device. Can you loan it to us for a while? I mean, there's a whole range of kinds of supports that they could be requesting. And I think if I were going to modify the system for myself, I would be more specific about the reports that are needed. And then ask that level of comfort question. But what we also know is that just doing that kind of online survey is going to require a follow-up of some sort. It's going to require that somebody contact the person who filled out that survey to get more information, and to do that step 1 and 2 of the stages of support, to talk about what's possible, what we can do for you, what we can't do for you, and then how to proceed and what the next steps are. And I know, Angie, you talked about your system, and I know you have quite a variety of different ways of approaching different students. So this kind of conversation, I think, would be really important for you to be having if you did modify this to a request for support. These are the kinds of things that you might talk about in that phone call, and you might also be gathering some additional information about assessments that have been done over time. You're going to treat those requests differently based on the information you get here, but also on what you know about the people. So if you've got a teacher, Deb, you just said it, a teacher who filled it out yesterday and is filling it out again today with different kinds of answers. People who do, several requests for support at the same time for different students in their classroom. people where you know they're just beginning to use assistive technology as opposed to people that have been using it for a long time. You will use your triage approach differently based on the information that you get from that request for support. But also you'll be gathering data if you use an online system that tells you where your requests are most needed, where the topics of the requests, the people who request. You can sort by school, you can sort by academic area, you can sort by whether people want equipment or professional development, things like that. So that's the reason for talking about the online thing. One final thing I want to talk about as you think about this idea of triage, of not doing everything the same for everybody, is to think about when you make that agreement about your, sorry, that's my answering machine gonna go. When you make that agreement about how you're going to work together, you will find that some people need different approaches. So let's talk about one other big idea that I've explored in the last few years, and that is the idea that the supports you provide may be different based on the needs of the person. So consultation, collaboration, and coaching are three different ways of approaching providing supports. So consultation, and let me go back, they all have different focuses, ways of approaching things, and goals of the support. Consultation is defined as sort of the expert. I love these graphics because they really help to, I think, exemplify what you're going to do in a different in this situation. So you decide, okay, in this case, I want to be a consultant. Well, a consultant is a person with tons of knowledge, so much knowledge, such weighty knowledge that they need a hand truck to bring it all to you. And they are providing factual information that could be used to bring to the situation so that you get the kind of support you need. Ironically, consultation is best used for people who know very little about the topic, or for people who know a whole lot about the topic and just need some factual information. So a consultant is a person in a position to have some influence over the situation, but who has no direct power to make changes or implement programs. When I first started working in assistive technology, I was always a consultant. I was always going in and saying, these are the facts, ma'am, just like Dragnet. And I was always providing specific factual information. These are some of the characteristics of consultation. What we know about consultation is that it really works best when there's an answer, resolution of an immediate concern. So when we're going to take factual information to a situation, we're acting as a consultant. But many of our implementation challenges don't have answers. So in that case, what we may be doing is collaborating. So we're going to share decision making as we work toward a common goal. I think most of us would prefer to work here as a person who's collaborating, working with the teachers, working with the staff. But the problem with collaboration is because there's such a shared effort and such a shared amount of information and action and things like that, it takes a lot of time. So while many of the AT specialists I know say, oh, I'm a collaborator, I'm a big collaborator, they also then say, but I don't have time to do all the things that people want me to do. What we know is that when we do collaborate well, kids do better. This is one particular study about high-stakes assessments. When teachers collaborate, kids do better on assessments. That's a national study of not special ed, but general ed. But collaboration takes more time. So the third approach that you might want to look at is a coaching approach. And that's really what we've been talking about all day, all afternoon today, is a coaching approach. How can we get people to partner with us in thought-provoking and creative processes that inspire them to think about their own solutions? Coaching honors the client as the expert in his or her own life and believes that every client is creative, resourceful, and whole. So in a coaching approach to AT implementation, you can help people apply new practices, establish safe environments for experimenting, and you can be supportive to the work of your colleagues. Coaching works because it invites people to solve their own problems. And we could talk, I can do a full-day workshop on coaching sometime if you want, but what we want to talk about today is why it works. So here's a coaching chart that really changed how I think about everything. If I just give you the facts, research, and theory, like we've done today, you will remember only about 5% and be able to apply that 5%. If I give you a chance, research, theory, and demonstration, you'll be able to remember more, but you still will only apply that 5%, and usually that's like just a special kernel of knowledge or something. If I give you research, practice, theory, demonstration, and practice, you'll remember most of what happens, but you'll still only be able to apply about 5 to 10%. It's not until we add some kind of coaching or mentoring support to our assistive technology services that we begin to see a huge jump in implementation. And I fully believe that that is in part because we are saying to people, it is how will you solve this problem? Rather than giving them answers and telling them what to do, we're inviting them to make meaning out of the change that we're trying to implement. So hopefully we're circling back to where we started before earlier today, which is implementation is change. That was a really brief summary of these three models of support. You have a handout in your packet that has this in more detail, but I also am out of time, so I want to encourage you to just think about it. Do you go in as an expert? Do you go in as a collaborator? Or do you go in ways that help people identify and solve their own problems when you do your AT teamwork? Because how you approach it is critical into what they think the result, what they think their responsibility is. Now let me say, there is not one best way to do things, but I do think that at the stage of implementation, some coaching really goes a long way, in helping teachers implement and make sense in their own classrooms. So what we're encouraging you to do is to think more about the model of support you provide. How do you define it? What kinds of supports are you going to provide? And how will you build your own AT service delivery system so that it implies from the very beginning that it is the job of teachers and IEP teams to participate and take full responsibility for implementation rather than having that disconnect between the AT team and the IEP team. I want to go back to the new team that said we're a new team this year, and I know we're concerned about finding time to work with teachers as a team because everyone is so busy. So I want to encourage you to think about how you might do some of that triage and differentiate the services you provide so that you don't have to go every time as a team to do your assistive technology services.
I have now on the screen some of our upcoming webinars. Our next one, the 17th of November,